All right, I think we are ready to get started. Welcome to tonight's South Dakota District 10 Candidate Forum. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Kim Serwick, and I'll be your moderator for the evening. This forum is sponsored by the Brandon Valley Area Chamber of Commerce and the Brandon Valley Journal. Tonight's forum provides our candidates an opportunity to publicly present their views, opinions, and qualifications for running for office. Our candidates this evening are, for Senate, we've got Margaret Sutton and Rachel Wilson. And for our House representatives, we've got incumbent Doug Barthel and incumbent Stephen Haugard. So thank you all very much for coming. Tonight's format will proceed as follows. First, each of our candidates will be allowed up to a 2-minute introduction statement. We have a timekeeper seated here tonight that will limit candidates' responses to 2 minutes per question. After opening remarks, in rotating order, the candidates will then respond to a series of questions prepared by the Chamber and the Journal. We will then open the questioning to the floor with the same time limitations for responses. All questions must be in written form. Please feel free to grab a note card and pen. They're on the back table there. And go ahead and write down your question, and you can hand that over to Jill, and she'll get that up to us during that time. And then finally, we'll allow up to another 2 minutes for each candidate to give their closing statement. I'd also like to announce that this forum will be broadcast on Alliance Communications local channel at 6 p.m. on Saturday, October 27th, and again 6 p.m. Sunday, October 28th. We will also be posting the video on the Brandon Valley Chamber's YouTube page. I will try my very best to get that done tomorrow. So if you have any friends that aren't able to come tonight, definitely have them go ahead and get online and watch it there. Okay, so without further ado, let's start with our opening statements, and I am going to go ahead and we're going to start with Stephen.
Thank you very much, Kim. I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight, and I appreciate the Chamber of Commerce presenting this opportunity along with the Brandon Valley Journal. And I've enjoyed serving for 4 years and looking forward to another couple of years. I'm presently serving as Speaker Pro Tem of the House and hoping to be Speaker of the House this year. There are lots of great opportunities. This is an interesting time with a transition from governor to governor and new Attorney General, likely changes in some agencies, so it'll be interesting to see what develops. We have a lot of ideas that we can move forward this year, I think, and make some positive changes. There are a couple of things that I'm particularly interested in regards to mental health and chemical dependency issues, so those are a couple of the issues I'll deal with. So just thanks very much for the forum and opportunity to visit.
Well, thanks, Kim. Thanks to the Chamber as well for hosting, and Jill for your help. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this. I've only been in the legislature for 1 year. I was appointed last year by the governor due to a vacancy in our district, so I like to say I got in the easy way. I only had to convince one voter. Now I have to convince several thousand. So hopefully they're willing to support me as I go on. I'm a lifelong resident of South Dakota. Went to the University of South Dakota, got a degree in criminal justice, worked at the penitentiary for a year, and after that began a 30-year career in law enforcement with the Sioux Falls Police Department. Served in virtually every area and aspect of the department, and finished up the last 12 years of that career as the police chief for the city. Then moved on to a career in public affairs at Sanford Health. I've been in that role for about the last 3 years, but welcomed the opportunity to get back into public service with my appointment. I've served on a couple of different boards, or currently serve on a couple of boards. I've served on several over the years, but right now I'm on the McCross and Boys Ranch board as well as the Compass Center board. I've spent the last 17 years living in this district, so I consider myself very much invested in this, and looking forward to hopefully serving for another couple of years and representing the people of District 10. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move over to Margaret.
I'm Margaret Sutton, and thank you for coming, and thank you for the Chamber.
Try this again. That's on me. Sorry.
Okay,
Start
I'll
over.
start over. I'm Margaret Sutton. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Chamber, for hosting. I have very much enjoyed meeting many of you as I've been knocking on doors. I recently got appointed by the governor here in August, so I'm 4 months incumbent. I did have the opportunity to serve in the special session. I do have a science and technology degree. Also a business degree. I have an engineering support services background. I have a 20-plus career in the corporate America and technology. So I feel that my background in the analytical environment and in the business community is a lot that I can offer District 10 in South Dakota.
Thank you. And Rachel.
All right. Hi, you guys. I'm Rachel, running for Senate. And I do want to thank you guys all for coming today. Kim mentioned that we never really get this many people here, so this is fantastic to see so many people interested in this. I am a teacher in Sioux Falls. I've lived in Northeast Sioux Falls for, I think I moved there in 2014. And I'm blessed to have an amazing church family at Messiah New Hope. I graduated from SDSU with my undergrad degree, and then I worked in digital marketing for a few years before deciding to go back to school for political science. So I'm working on my master's in political science at USD right now, taking a little bit of time off, needed to work, make some more money back because grad school is expensive, and of course taking some time to campaign. So I am not originally from South Dakota. I'm originally from Texas, which people told me not to talk about, but it's part of who I am. And so I moved here in January of 2012 after completing my first year of college in Texas. And I knew I wanted to transfer out of state to a university where it was colder. So naturally I picked South Dakota, right? So when I moved up here, I immediately fell in love with the type of people here. And if you guys have ever lived anywhere else or even really traveled anywhere else, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because the people here are so much different than people anywhere else. The people here are so kind, loyal, trustworthy, hardworking, just incredible people. So I fell in love with the state of South Dakota because I fell in love with the people here, and I decided to stay when I graduated. Unlike many of my classmates who did move to other states to work, I chose to stay here because I love this state.
All right. Thank you all very much. We are going to move on to the prepared questions, and we will start with Doug on this one. The first question is, why are you seeking election, and what are your top priorities?
Well, as I said, after a 30-year career in public service, after being away from that for a couple of years, I felt the need to get back into that. I thoroughly enjoyed that work and representing the people, so this was an excellent opportunity with the appointment by the governor to get back into that role. So going into it, I had a lot to learn. I still have a lot to learn. Unfortunately, there aren't as many people as you would like to see that are willing to take on these roles. So I certainly hats off to those that are up here with me, because unfortunately there just aren't enough people that are willing to make that sacrifice. Frankly, driving back forth to Pier every weekend in the middle of the winter is not top on my list, but is certainly something that I'm willing and able to do. So probably, going into it, I didn't have an agenda. I didn't have a list of things that I wanted to accomplish and necessarily, have certain things that's the reason I'm in there. I'm in there to do what I think is best for the people of our district and our state, and just make good choices and use good common sense. With some of my background, I, of course, have got a certain interest in criminal justice and that aspect. I serve on the Judiciary Committee and very much enjoy being a part of that. I'm certainly going to be, looking for, I know we've gone through some criminal justice reform prior to my time in the legislature, but it seems like we're locking up fewer people, but do we really have all the alternatives that we need for, just simply not locking them up does not solve the problem. We have to have the various alternatives, whether it's treatment or counseling or supervision, those sort of things. So I'm going to continue to look for ways that we can use that as a way to control crime and deal with some of the people that are the repeat offenders. And so I look forward to the opportunity to try and do this work as we go on for the next couple of years.
All right, thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. Margaret, same question. Why are you seeking election, and what are your top priorities?
When I moved here in 2008, I'm also from Texas, and coming from an engineering background, I could not find a job. And my husband and I had to make a decision. Do we stay here in Sioux Falls and support our children and grandchildren, or do we make the decision to move to a bigger city? And that was a very difficult decision, because if we stayed here, it would primarily mean it would end my career. But we felt that family was very important, so we made the decision to stay here in Sioux Falls to support the children and the grandchildren. And I have no regrets about that decision, but as a result of that, it gave me a passion to make sure that we have a good business climate, that we have the job opportunities for our children and for our grandchildren. I want to see my grandchildren here in South Dakota, the surrounding areas, but the only way we're going to do that is with a strong business climate. I am definitely pro-family and a strong family, and I'm for pro-life, limited government, less taxes, also for Second Amendment as well. Thank you.
All right, last but not least, nope, actually, I've got myself confused now. Rachel, sorry, same question. It is, why are you seeking election, and what are your top priorities?
Okay, so I mentioned a little bit ago that most of my classmates, when we graduated undergrad, a lot of them left the state. And just in general, I see that a lot from people my age. They finish high school or they finish college, and then they leave the state and they don't come back. And I don't know if you guys remember, about 2 years ago, there was a letter written into the Argus Leader from a young woman who had graduated from USD Law School, and then once she graduated, decided to move her family to Colorado. And so she wrote this letter into the Argus Leader because she had also seen this trend kind of happening with the people in her life. And she talked about how much she loved South Dakota, how much she loved the people in South Dakota. So a lot of the same reasons that I fell in love with the state. But she talked about how they didn't feel like this was a place to raise their family, because they didn't feel like this was a place where they were represented. They didn't feel like this was a place where they were listened to or heard. So they moved to a state where they felt they were represented and were heard. And when that letter first came out, a lot of my own Facebook friends were sharing that. And they were saying, like, yeah, this is why I want to leave, or this is why I can't wait to leave. This is why I left. But when I read her letter, it didn't sit the same way with me. Because I love this state, as I've said numerous times already. And to me, when you recognize that it has a problem, which I don't think anyone here would say that South Dakota is perfect. We all know that there are problems that need to be fixed. But rather than moving to a state where it's already, fixed, I want to stay here and work for the state that I love to make this a state that can truly represent all of us. And plus, there are so many people throughout the state who don't have the means to go anywhere else, and they still deserve to be represented. They still deserve to be heard and listened to. And so I'm staying here. I'm going to work for South Dakota. I'm going to work on improving education, workforce development, and then just overall government responsibility.
All right, thank you. Now, last but not least, Stephen.
Thank you. My reason for seeking public office to begin with was to give something back. I've practiced law in Sioux Falls for 35 years, but I grew up on a farm just southwest of Madison. And I come from a background of service as far as military service. My grandfather being in the Danish cavalry and came here, and he served in the U.S. Army after that. My father served in World War II, fought his way through the Philippines, through Japan, and came back and worked hard and bought a farm, just like my grandfather had done. And my brother's retired out of the Air Force. I never served. Vietnam was just coming to an end when I graduated high school, so I didn't end up going into the service. But I see this as an opportunity to do something, where I can give back to the community that's been so good to me. And I believe my background in education is valuable in that respect. I also have seen significant erosion of our local culture over the past 40 or 50 years. It's changed dramatically. And that's part of my interest. You know, those are the heritage that I was born into, were the things that made this state and this nation great. And I don't want to see that degraded any more than what it has. So that's part of my interest. As far as top priorities in serving right now, I have a background in psychology and criminal justice and all those kinds of things. So there's an important need right now to address the mental health issues. We have phenomenal numbers of petitions for people who are a danger to self or others here in Minnehaha County. And I've served on that board for 25 years, so I've seen that change. And that's one of the things we need to address, and that combined with drug and alcohol issues, it's something that I have the background for, and I'd like to make a difference there.
All right, thank you. All right, for the next question, we will start with Margaret. It is, what is your stance on legislation that would allow local municipalities the option through local elections to collect an extra penny sales tax for the purpose of funding specific capital projects? Microphone.
I am definitely for lower taxes, but before I say no on that, I would definitely want to hear all the support and both sides of the issue. I want to make sure that I have all the info before I make a solid decision on that. I also believe that there's also could be other alternatives instead of supporting a higher tax. Let's see what those alternatives are.
All right, thank you. Rachel.
So there are a lot of different kinds of cities throughout the state. You know, Brandon is very different from Sioux Falls, which is very different than, you know, Spearfish, Gregory, any of those cities. They're all very different. And so I don't think that that the state legislature should necessarily say, no, these local municipalities cannot vote to raise their own taxes. Yeah, most of us are against raising the taxes. I think all of us here would say that we do not want to raise our taxes. But then again, if a local group, if the voters in a local municipality vote because they think something is so important that they are willing to raise their own taxes, I don't think the state legislature should say, you know, no, you can't do this. So I feel like the local municipalities and the people that are voting there, they know what's best for them. And so, of course, if there was, you know, a legislation that was brought to me, I would, of course, want to look at it and make sure that there were certain protections in there, you know, that the taxes weren't just indefinite. There's a time frame, sunset clause, they had an ending point, you know, a phase out, something like that. I would want to make sure that that was in there. But overall, I think that, you know, I would be for a less overbearing state government with that, giving more control back to the local municipalities there.
Thank you. Stephen, before I let you go again, I'm going to just read it again for everyone to remember what the question is. What is your stance on legislation that would allow local municipalities the option through local elections to collect an extra penny sales tax for the purpose of funding specific capital projects?
Thanks for the question. It's a good question. It's something we've discussed plenty of times in peer, and I think it's kind of goes hand in hand with this Amendment X that's on the ballot this year too. It's Amendment X is the one that raises the voter limit from 50 to 55%, and that's kind of the way I would look at this. I understand the idea of local control, and we tout that a lot in the legislature, that it's important to have local control, but at the same time you don't want to necessarily open the floodgates of the opportunity for municipalities to tax their citizens either. So I would probably look seriously at something that is in the nature of a higher threshold of voter turnout. If you've got 75% of the people in the municipality that vote in favor of it, then maybe that's a reasonable way to approach it. And again, back to Amendment X, that should be higher than 55% to change your constitution, but that's the best we could hope for this year. But as far as the local tax opportunity, I would consider something along that line. I think that puts it into a situation where if there's that much of a groundswell of support for it, then it's probably a reasonable thing to trust the local municipality to go ahead and impose that tax. But if it's just a coin toss, if it's a 50-50 kind of a situation, then I would be opposed to it. So that'd be my perspective on it for right now.
All right, thank you. Doug?
Well, currently, I don't think there's an appetite for a new tax, but That being said, do I think that this is not an option? No. I'd certainly be open to this as an option going forward. The key to this is, and that was in your question, up to the elected or to the people to vote on whether or not they want to approve it. And if it's something that they're willing to approve and pay for, I'd certainly be open to that. I do sympathize with municipalities and especially our counties because they find themselves struggling with ways to support different, whether it be capital improvements or infrastructure, all sorts of things that, frankly, there aren't enough dollars to go around. So, again, I'm not in favor of, going wild with raising taxes, but I know that government isn't free, and these sort of projects aren't free, and sometimes there are no other options on how they can support it. So it's certainly something that I'd be open to.
All right, thank you very much. And we got everybody right. I'm getting myself confused on where we start and where we go next. Okay, so Rachel, you're the first one for the third and final prepared question that we have. One of the biggest challenges South Dakota faces is having enough people with the right skills and capabilities for South Dakota jobs. What do you believe are the most effective strategies to ensure a properly trained workforce?
Thank you for that question, because I really enjoy this area particularly. Because I mentioned before that keeping people who are talented and educated here in the state and how important that is to me. And I really think that that this touches so many areas besides what we would typically consider workforce development. I think it really starts with just creating a culture where the people who are here feel listened to, feel heard, feel respected, feel represented, and then people are going to want to stay just on a really basic internal level. But then I think that any time that we have a chance to improve education, I think that has a huge impact on just workforce readiness in general. So I have substitute taught at New Tech High. So I don't know if you guys are very familiar with them, but it's a fantastic school. I loved when I'd be able to sub there. It's a very project-based school where the teachers work with them to help them build relationships within the community and really prepare them for what it's like after high school. And I think any chance we have to promote those sorts of programs or styles of education throughout the state, I think we should go for that. I also think that we have amazing tech schools in this state, and we should be giving them all the tools that we can so that they can succeed and continue help educating people in the state so that we can have a great workforce. Anytime that we can have high schools having programs that help direct people into apprenticeships, anything like that, I think it's going to really help making sure we have this trained workforce that's ready to work in South Dakota. And I think the District 10 is growing in a very unique way. It's growing in a very diverse way, more diverse than it ever has been in the past. And so I think because of that, we need to be very innovative and flexible with the type of solutions we come up with as far as making sure we have a ready workforce in our area. So I think that we need to be doing everything we can to make sure people who are here and talented want to stay here, and that we're also preparing the next generation.
All right, thank you. Same question. Stephen.
Yeah, I think it's important for the voters and all citizens, whether they vote or not, to understand the limitations of government. In regard to education, our Constitution is pretty focused. And the first paragraph of the Article 8 of our Constitution says something pretty close to this. It talks about the importance of ensuring the stability of a Republican form of government. It's essential that the citizens be both moral and intelligent. Therefore, the legislature will establish a uniform system of education free to the public. That's what it says. We've gone way beyond that scope. The idea of education was essentially primary education. That's why we call it primary education. That was the core of learning, and it was probably started out grades 1 through 4 and expanded to 1 through 6 and then 1 through 8 eventually. And I remember as I was growing up, there were still some of the kids a few years ahead of me still went through 8th grade graduation, and that was the end of primary education. So we've gone beyond the scope to quite an extent. As far as vocational training, it's a great idea, but again, it's beyond the scope of what the state's responsibility really is. I spoke at New Tech this afternoon to the government class and talked about this idea that government is not supposed to be in every realm of life. And this is one of those where it's not the role of the government to ensure a workforce. It's the role of the community to grow and thrive, and the government stays out of its road. So we need to remember the limitations of government when we go into this. Thankfully, our country was not founded on the idea that we're going to create workers for the government. Our country is founded on the idea that we're going to have well-informed, moral citizens to go ahead and make a community and a country that's thriving.
All right, thank you. And Doug, let me read it one more time for everyone before you answer. One of the biggest challenges South Dakota faces is having enough people with the right skills and capabilities for South Dakota jobs. What do you believe are the most effective strategies to ensure a properly trained workforce?
Well, there's no doubt that workforce development is a challenge and something that we can't ignore. I think there was a day where college was the only option, or the option that we really tried to steer a lot of our youth towards. And as a college graduate, I certainly advocate for that, but it's not the only option. And I think we need to do a better job of educating our youth that there are other options, whether it be technical schools or things of that nature. And I think it's also important that we continue to work with employers, those that are actually looking for people to fill some of these roles, and develop more of the private-public partnerships through scholarships and job recruitment, job placement if they're successful in a program. And that actually kind of ties in a little bit with the prior question about funding of projects and different things that are necessary. I think it's important that we continue those public-private partnerships, and we've seen that success in other challenges around the state, and how those partnerships have definitely helped with that. So I think it's also important that we continue to emphasize, the STEM different venue or science, technology, engineering, and math, and that's really where a lot of the emphasis needs to be. And I'm confident that through some more education with our youth and steering them towards some of these jobs, we can be more successful in filling some of those challenges that they have.
All right. And Margaret?
To answer this question directly, I believe that the solution is to create a strong business climate. I come from a background of also doing training. I did training for within Texas and also outside of Texas, as well as outsourced training. And what I learned from that was that there's several avenues of directing this challenge, and one is, are you trying to expand your workforce? Are you wanting to increase the knowledge of your current workforce, whether it's 10 employees or whether it's 500 employees? Coming from the background that I have, we were required to do 40 hours a year, at least, to expand and keep up with the latest technology. It also, with the business climate we have here, in South Dakota as well as in District 10, is very often what happens is you do not have the skill set needed for these companies to expand. So often what that means is that you're having to bring in the skill set from out of state. So that means competitive salaries. So there's you really have to look at this in different avenues to address that problem. I definitely believe in creating better partnerships, either whether it's with the universities, within the businesses. So you really need to look at all avenues. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. That concludes our prepared questions. Now we are going to go on to ballot questions. We've got two on here where we're curious of your positions. We will be starting with Stephen, with the first one being Initiated Measure 25, which is an initiated measure increasing the state tobacco tax and creating a post-secondary technical institute fund for the purposes of lowering student tuition and providing financial support to the state post-secondary technical institutes. And just to keep things flowing good, I did get a question from the audience that piggybacks on this. So if you are not in favor of IM 25, what is your strategy for helping reduce the cost of technical schools?
Well, thanks for the question. No, I'm not in favor of 25, and for a variety of reasons. You know, we've got, presently we have the lottery system in place, which was designed to, or supposedly designed to enhance the funding for public education. Well, not so much. And in fact, that's created all sorts of consequences that should have been obvious but weren't well considered. IM 25 is another one of those bills that's already been considered by the legislature. It's flown through the legislature as far as an idea, a thought, and it was shot down, and it was obvious it was not going to pass. So, you know, that's the perspective of those that have taken a look at it and considered it, and it just didn't go anyplace there. And again, it's for the reason that why do we pick on people that have a vulnerability? You know, there's a quote from Benjamin Franklin that talks about a government should never act viciously toward its people. And the idea of the root word of vicious is vice. And so why do we pick on people that have a vice in their life that maybe they don't even want? But I mean, we look for someone who is inclined toward use of cigarettes or tobacco and ask them to fund vocational training. Well, we've got plenty of resources in our budget. It's just how do we spend them? We're almost at $5 billion a year in expenditures. If we want to reduce those costs, we can do that. We just need to rearrange our budget. And the idea of reducing that cost per student, it's to create some efficiencies. We have created some buildings out there that are overbuilt and too expensive. And there are ways to address the problem without picking on some source of revenue that's unreliable and focuses on somebody with a particular problem. So.
All right, Doug, same question. What is your position on initiated Measure 25? And if you're not in favor, what is your strategy for helping reduce the cost of technical schools?
Well, do I think it's the best way to solve our problem? No. But we do have the third highest rate of tuition for technical schools in our area, and frankly, other efforts to try and reduce that have been unsuccessful. I too don't like increasing taxes, especially on people that might be a little more vulnerable, but I see this actually as a couple of wins. You know, it will help fund it. No, I don't think it'll sustain and take care of the problem forever, but it will at least help alleviate some of that as we go forward for the next few years. But it will hopefully also help reduce the number of people that begin the use of tobacco. The American Cancer Society predicts that about 3,200 kids won't start smoking because of the cost of a pack of cigarettes. So if we can prevent that many from not beginning to smoke and in addition help reduce some of these tuition costs, it's something that I would support.
All right, thank you. And Margaret, before I get you going here, I'm going to read this one more time. We're wondering what your position is on initiated Measure 25, which is an initiated measure increasing the state tobacco tax and creating a post-secondary technical institute fund for the purposes of lowering student tuition and providing financial support to the state post-secondary technical institutes. And the follow-up of if you are not in favor of IM 25, what is your strategy for helping reduce the cost of technical schools?
Measure 25 will definitely increase tax on our hard-working South Dakotans, and I'm not for that. So I do not support Resolution 25. It also does not have protection against wasteful spending. Also, it hurts our retailers. It's going to reduce potential job loss. It's going to increase smuggling across state lines. And what's the solution for this? I don't have a direct solution for that, but I do think we can work more closely with our institutions, create partnerships, but I'm definitely not for Measure 25. Thank you.
All right, same question to you, Rachel.
Okay, well, for this, I will admit that as a private citizen, I would likely vote differently than if I were voting on this as legislation in peer. And so if I were in peer as a senator and this came across my desk, I would likely vote against it because raising the taxes does not sound like something that I think we should be looking at right now, especially on tobacco. So a lot of the opponents to this bill focus on this money that it would generate and where it goes, and if it actually goes to the tech schools or if it goes to the general fund, or if it's like a sustainable revenue stream. And when you're looking at all of that, no, I don't think it's a great bill. But when you focus on the other side, that's where me, as a personal citizen, I will be voting yes on IM 25. And that's because there's just a plethora of research out there that talks about when you increase the cost of tobacco, all of the other areas that this decreases negative side effects from tobacco. So, like you mentioned, the American Cancer Society says that this bill will prevent 3,200 kids from starting smoking and becoming an adult smoker. So that's a huge number. It's going to have a 10.7% decrease in kids under the age of 18 smoking, and it would prevent 1,900 people from dying prematurely of smoking. 1,900 people. That's a lot. That's, my grandma who started smoking when she was pretty young and got lung cancer. That's the people in your lives that you care about that have smoked all their lives and are now dealing with the consequences of that. So if we can stop people from smoking at a very young age, personally, I'm all for that.
All right, thank you. And we will be starting with Doug on the second of our two ballot questions. What is your position on Constitutional Amendment W, which is an initiated amendment to the South Dakota Constitution, changing campaign finance and lobbying laws, creating a government accountability board, and changing certain initiative and referendum provisions?
Well, I wasn't part of the legislature when the original version of this law was revised by the legislature and put in place, but I do certainly support the things that were put in place to replace what was the old initiated measure 22. I'm not against all of everything in this proposed amendment. There are some things that are good, and I'm certainly not opposed to any sort of oversight. Coming from a career in law enforcement, that's basically what we did for our job, was enforce the law and oversee people and make sure they follow the rules, and so I'm certainly open to that. Where I am concerned is this proposed amendment has over 3,000 words in it. Most people have no idea what all the language is that's in here. You're going to see a small summary when you go to vote, and that's what you're going to base your decision on. The Constitution isn't something that we should take lightly when we change it. And I think it's important, I'm not going to tell you which way to vote on this, but if you are going to vote on it, I would highly encourage you to educate yourself and look at this and look at the language that's in there. There's at least 3 different places in there where it talks about notwithstanding anything else in the Constitution, which basically makes this thing the supreme law when it comes to the areas that it's addressing, and that causes me great concern. I personally am not going to vote for this. We'll have to live with whatever the will of the people is, but I do have concerns when it comes to changing our Constitution.
All right. Thank you very much. Margaret, what is your position on Constitutional Amendment W?
I think this is a poor conceived measure, so I would not support this measure. It would radically change the form of government that we currently have in South Dakota. It would establish an organization operating outside our established 3-branch government that we have now. It clearly states in our legislature now that the legislature has the authority to appropriate monies, and this would change that. It would directly misappropriate money, and often when this happens, it increases taxes. It would also inhibit the contact with the current, the way we have contact with our current legislatures, and that's not good. This was already addressed in 2017 with the current legislation session in 2017. So with that being said, I would not support this. Thank you.
All right, Rachel, before I have you go for this question, again, we're wondering on positions of Constitutional Amendment W, an initiated amendment to the South Dakota Constitution, changing campaign finance and lobbying laws, creating a government accountability board, and changing certain initiative and referendum provisions.
Okay, well, I'll start by saying that I 100% support the idea of what this amendment's trying to accomplish, but not necessarily the way it's trying to accomplish it. So I do support the idea of creating an independent ethics advisory board. And one thing I do really like about W is the way that it lays out the selection of the members of the board. I really believe that it's a very fair and balanced way to select these members of this commission. But, and I also love that it's trying to protect voters in the sense that it's making it so that, the legislature can't just go and repeal whatever the voters voted on. So I do really like that. But I'm worried about it because when I was reading the entirety of this 8-page bill, it talks about giving, certain powers to this board. And it never... It's a very broad scope of powers that it gives this board. It gives them the power to impose sanctions, issue orders, commence administrative actions, and there's really no constraint around this power that they've been delegated, and that really worries me. So I do really like what this bill is trying to do. I don't think this is the bill that actually does that.
Thank you. And last but not least, Steve.
Thank you very much. I certainly oppose the bill. And this is generated in the wake of what's been asserted from out-of-state interests. This is, again, the same Massachusetts-based organization that's pushing this with a fair amount of resources. It's based on the idea that somehow South Dakota is one of the most corrupt states in the nation. And I think it rates us higher than Illinois, which I believe in the past several years had 3 of their governors in prison. The numbers that are associated with this corruption idea are somewhere in the low 60s. I want to say it's 63 cases of acts of quote-unquote corruption that were prosecuted in South Dakota over a time frame, it's either 5 or 10 years. But during that period of time, those cases of corruption that were prosecuted, all but one involved tribal activities. There were like 62 cases prosecuted on the reservations probably for some sort of embezzlement. And one case was prosecuted at the state level, which was based on apparently a guard or a state-employed staff member in the mailroom at the penitentiary, presumably took money out of an envelope or something. And so that's how we get the rating for corruption. And this continues to be blown out of proportion as far as who does what. And the idea that legislators and peer get wads of money under the table, it's just ridiculous. And on top of that, this becomes a 4th branch of government. And as I read through this, I can read this. I've got 20 years of education and 35 years of law practice. But I saw a rating, this calls for 20.9 years of education to read and comprehend this bill. It's rated by a method that the federal government developed. 20.9 years of education to read and understand it. But it's stated at the outset, the synopsis says it's likely to be challenged on constitutional grounds, and it will be. And on top of that, the striking statement in there that this overrides anything in our Constitution, that's just wrong. So it's ill-conceived.
All right. Well, as the moderator that doesn't take positions, since y'all are in the same boat, I do want you all to know that the Brandon Valley Area Chamber of Commerce has taken a position as no on W, along with 40 other organizations, including South Dakota Chamber of Commerce, Sioux Falls Chamber of Commerce, and the Retailers Association. So I will go back down to being level here. Okay, so that concludes our ballot questions that we had in written form. So now we are going to go to our questions from the audience. Again, if you have a question, there should be some note cards on the back table and some pens. You can go ahead and write your question down, get it over to Jill. I do have a lot up here, so we will go until 8 o'clock if you do have questions, so please bring them up. But I think we will go ahead and get started here. We are on Margaret, and this first question is, with the advance in digital calling, VoIP, and the rise of spoofing, what do you think the state legislature should do to cut back on the number of spam calls residents receive each day?
You know, I want to appreciate the calls that we do get, but personally, I know I don't have a home phone anymore because I've got so many calls. As the alternative for that, I think we need more community support for that and different voices for that. I think as we do go into the digital world, I think phone calls and spamming will gradually decrease. So we definitely need to look for other alternatives.
All right, thank you. Rachel?
Well, I will say that this is not at all a question I anticipated. But I do think, and I will also say that I currently right now do not have an answer, but it's something that I would definitely look towards the people of District 10, as well as other experts in the area, to see if this is something that the state legislature should even involve itself in. But it does remind me of something that I do think is very important, and that's that we are in an ever-changing climate for just digital climate. We have new technologies coming out all the time, and we as the state legislature need to remember that and make sure that we are planning for that in the types of legislation that we pass, so that, you know, if we're making certain bills that are so specific now, which I do think that bills should be narrowly tailored, but we have to remember that you know, the climate is ever evolving, and we need to make sure that we're making legislation that can adapt with the changing climate.
All right, Stephen?
As far as spam calls, unfortunately, we don't have the switchboard downtown anymore with the individual cables and plugs, so we don't have a lot of control over that. It's obviously going to be a federal issue, and even at the federal level, they have precious little they can do to control some of these things, because you have offshore entities that can access the web well enough that they can make the calls look like they're local, but they're not. So it's something that maybe at the federal level they can do something in telecommunications, but it's far more complicated than anything the state can address.
Doug?
Well, I'm certainly as annoyed by them as anybody else is, and believe me, if there was a way that we could legislate something to put a stop to it, I'd be the first one to bring that bill forward. I've gotten numerous calls. I got a call the other day. I looked at it, it said Faith, South Dakota. Okay, this one I can actually answer. Nope, it was for a new car warranty, and again, they just spoofed it. And as Steve said, you know, with a lot of these, you'll find that most of them are coming from certainly outside of our state, but probably the majority are coming from outside of our country. So good luck enforcing them, especially at the state level. If anything is going to happen, it's probably going to happen at the federal level. You know, there was a time when the do not call list meant do not call, and it actually worked for a while, but frankly now I think there are very few places that even follow that anymore. Legitimate companies certainly do, but yeah, it's annoying. I would welcome anybody that has an idea of how we could put a stop to it, because as I said, I'd be more than happy to support that.
All right, thank you. And the next question, we're going to start with Rachel from the audience, is, would you support a law to keep guns out of the hands of convicted domestic abusers?
So I don't have exact numbers at this point in time, but I do know that I've read studies that talk about the increase in the probability for gun violence when convicted domestic abusers have guns, weapons of any sort. overall, I think just the ability for and the right for South Dakotans to have guns is very important. It's part of our culture. It's part of the backbone of our society, and I do believe that we have the right to bear arms, as it says in the Second Amendment. That being said, I do think that there are instances where we should maybe take a second look at that. And I think in areas where we have people that we know have this tendency towards violence, especially in family or relationship situations, I think we should be working towards preventing future gun violence any way that we can.
All right, Stephen, would you support a law to keep guns out of the hands of convicted domestic abusers?
I think that's one of those that goes down to the circuit court level for a decision as far as the individual cases. We certainly do have a culture of hunting, fishing, and all that sort of thing. There's a lot of people that enjoy those opportunities, and sometimes they end up in conflicts that are problematic. So I think it should rest with the local circuit court to make some of those decisions. One size fits all doesn't fit all. It's what the federal government's tried to do over the years with, for example, federal sentencing guidelines. They don't work. Had all sorts of odd consequences in those kinds of cases. And this, I certainly think it's important to restrain people that can't restrain themselves, but you'd have to really consider on a case-by-case basis whether this applies for this individual.
All right, Doug.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there are some provisions in place already that prohibit that. And I'm certainly a gun advocate and gun supporter, but there are certain cases and situations where, frankly, people shouldn't have guns, and this would, I think, fall into one of those categories. But again, it's a case-by-case basis, and as Steve mentioned too, I think it's important that we involve the judiciary in this, and then that way they can weigh all the different situations and different factors that come into play, and ultimately make that decision. So.
All right, Margaret.
Our current Second Amendment definitely states that abiding American citizens can bear arms, and I'm definitely for Second Amendment. But again, I don't think anyone in this room would want anyone who is convicted to have a gun in their hand, or anyone who has mental challenges. So again, that has to be weighed carefully and have a lot of discernment when that comes to a solution, is whether someone can bear arms. But let's keep with the Constitution and keep that to American citizens and abiding law citizens. Thank you.
All right, moving right along. The next question from the audience. With some states already having legalized recreational use of marijuana, what would be the candidate's position vote on such a proposal in the South Dakota legislature? Starting with Steve.
Thanks. That's a great question, because we've looked at it and I've made my position very clear. This is a design for disaster. I think it comes in large part from people my age and in their 40s, because they grew up with this idea that marijuana was just cool and recreational, and the fact is that the THC content of marijuana back in the 70s was something like 2%, and now it's up to 30% THC content. Far different drug, dramatically different. And what I'm seeing is, serving on the Board of Mental Illness, over the past few months, I've had a number of cases where I had people in front of me that had significant problems with schizophrenia, and it seems to be supported by the research that significant marijuana use in teen years can lead to this, and that's what I'm personally seeing just handling those kinds of cases in the Sioux Falls. On top of that, my daughter and I did a presentation over to USF a few months ago in regard to marijuana use, and talked to the Attorney General's office in Colorado. Significant spike in illegal marijuana use. 70% increase in marijuana-related fatalities. It's just truly a design for disaster, and it's a gateway drug. There's no doubt about it. And so as my generation and just the years below, have started to take the approach that, well, maybe this is just okay, it's something to enjoy, that's foolishness. I've had plenty of folks I spoke to over the years that were in their late 20s, early 30s. Marijuana doesn't bother me. Well, you're divorced, you're looking at some criminal charges, you don't have a job. It's one of those things that people get lulled into that somehow it's okay, and in fact it's not. It's just a way to bring people into the drug culture, and that is the last place people need to be.
All right. Doug, what is your position on legalized recreational use of marijuana?
I'm sure this will come as a shock to you as a former police chief, but I am adamantly opposed to this. If you speak with law enforcement in Colorado, which is one of many now that have legalized it, it's truly a disaster. From a law enforcement aspect and even as a citizen, the issues that they're having to deal with, people driving high, the number of traffic fatalities has gone up considerably, and a lot of them are because of marijuana usage. And don't forget that marijuana is still illegal federally. Even though a state enacts a law and makes it legal, it's still against the law federally. That's why the banks won't accept the cash that comes to them because of sales of marijuana. So these states and different shops and everything, they have to deal with cash. They have bags of cash. They can't take them to a bank. Nobody will accept it that way. So everything they transact is in cash. And then also, as Steve talked about, it's certainly a gateway drug and leads to other things. I spoke with a person that's involved in meth prevention and counseling, and to a person, every person that they've dealt with that's had a meth issue or addiction all started with marijuana. Not a one of them started with the use of meth. So it's a drug that we think is just harmless, and it's just like a little bit different than drinking alcohol. Well, that's not the case, because as it was mentioned, the potency of this drug is so much higher than it once was, and there's just so many ill effects that because of that I think we as taxpayers are going to be stuck with the tab and have to deal with that when we think it's just going to be an easy way to generate some revenue. I think it'd be a disaster.
All right. Margaret, what is your position on legalized recreational use of marijuana?
I definitely agree with Steve and Doug that this is a gateway drug, and I know that not everyone who takes marijuana automatically goes into bigger drugs, but definitely this is a gateway, and I would not support this.
Rachel.
Well, I think as South Dakota, before we could even consider recreational use, we would need to look into medicinal. And in that area, I do think that we should look a little bit more into that, because especially when we're in a time where we have so many issues with overuse of like opioids and stuff like that, if we can have alternative medicines such as cannabis that can help alleviate some pain and just make the comfort of life a little bit better for some people with some really chronic problems, I think we should definitely look more into that. And then after that, I think we need to look more into decriminalizing possession of marijuana, because we have people that are in jail and prison for having not very much, and they're in prison for just as long as some serious offenses, and that costs the state money, and so I think we would need to look into those related issues to marijuana before we could even look at recreational use. But that being said, I will disagree with the other people up here. I've read ample research that it is not a gateway drug. I also know that, yes, there are issues with, the potency of it, but a lot of that comes from when it is done and produced and distributed illegally, there's a lot less regulation with it. One benefit of having the recreational marijuana is that the government does have more of an ability to make sure that what goes into that is up to a certain standard. But that being said, I don't know that South Dakota is even remotely ready to look at recreational use of marijuana. Something with medicinal use, I think, would be something that we should look into.
All right, thank you very much. And we are off to our next question, starting with Doug. How will you support South Dakota families that are worried about losing health care coverage because they have a pre-existing condition like cancer?
Well, I think there are already some provisions in place for pre-existing conditions. I think it's, that is one aspect of the healthcare reform that I think is good. I, I know healthcare comes with a cost, and insurance certainly is not free. I don't think we should socialize medicine and have healthcare free for everyone, but I do think there are ways that we can help alleviate some of that. I'd certainly be open to looking at some of that.
Okay, Margaret, how will you support South Dakota families that are worried about losing health care coverage because they have a pre-existing condition like cancer?
I think this is a issue that does not need to be concerned about. I took chemo myself, and I have not experienced any pre-existing conditions at all. So from personal experience, I have not had any problems with that. And so I don't believe this is an issue that we need to address, right? That it is an issue.
All right, Rachel?
I think it's so sad that this is something that some people are worried about. Cancer is already something that's just, it's huge. It's so difficult to deal with when that's something that you're facing or someone that you love is facing. And having to even consider the idea that your insurance would no longer cover you or you wouldn't be able to get insurance because you have cancer, I think is just devastating. It is so expensive having cancer and getting treatment for that. So to families that would be worried about it not being covered because it being considered a pre-existing condition, I would say that I'm going to personally do anything I can to make sure that insurance companies would not be able to deny you insurance because you have cancer. That should not ever be a thing that's allowed. Yeah.
Stephen, do you need me to repeat the question?
No,
Okay.
thanks. Unfortunately, over the past 40 years, 30 years, there's been this shift in thought that somehow the government owes us all these things. And I defy anyone to find me a place in our Constitution that says that we owe the citizens health care. And the idea that you can tell an insurance company how to run their business, that you have to take these people and insure them even though it's going to create a loss, I mean, it's just outside of the scope of any intelligent business model. I understand the idea of being compassionate, but that's the role of individuals and communities. It's not the role of government. So as far as pre-existing health conditions and forcing insurability, I guess if we're going to stay in the healthcare field, which I'm hoping that we're weaning ourselves out of it, if we have to stay in it, certainly there can be some accommodations that you make even at the state level to require certain companies, if they're going to do business within the state, that they'd have to comply with a pre-existing problem. But what you see happen is they take off and go elsewhere. There's just a handful of companies that are around after the Affordable Care Act, which made everything unaffordable, especially for me. Just my example was when President Obama took office, our health insurance premiums were about $400 a month. Right now, they're just under $1,800 a month. And that's because of the Affordable Care Act and the socialization of medicine. It does not work. You can't take over a seventh of the, or I think it's a seventh of the economy, and expect to effectively do that with government rules and regulations. And you can look at the Indian healthcare system and the VA system, and you can see how ineffective it can be. So as much as we can do to avoid it is my preference.
All right, the next question, starting with Margaret, is how important is it to get millennials and Gen Z involved in the political process, and how do you plan on doing it?
Having a granddaughter in that category, it is very important. You know, South Dakota is very well known for their work ethic. So how do we continue that into the next generation? It is very important that the new generations get involved. I am fully in support, and I have been president of Siouxland Republican Women, and that was one of my main focus, was to get the young involved, and that is a deep concern with me, that we have a little bit of apathy. But that being said, I was very much encouraged here knocking on doors that I had several young people as I answered the door and said, I do have questions for you. I just do not want to vote for you just because you're telling me to vote for you. So one of the individuals asked me to come back later on a Sunday afternoon and talk to him specifically about the issue. So to support this, I believe it's very, very important that we do the right education, educating our youngsters, making sure that they still know history in education. I'm going way back here. I think I might be the oldest one on this panel, but I do remember history being taught at a different level when I was in school. And so we definitely need to keep history in our schools as well as educating our young adults.
All right, Rachel, how important is it to get millennials and Gen Z involved in the political process, and how do you plan on doing it?
Yeah, I love this question because I'm a millennial. So obviously, I think it's quite important for us to be involved. But I think it's more than just important for us to be involved. I think it's important for us to make sure that that we're not just promoting getting involved in like politics in a national level, because local politics is where it's really important. This is where, you know, we really can make a difference. It's where it really touches our lives. And when we can get other young people involved and interested in local politics, that's the area that I think is really going to have the biggest impact. You know, we have a lot of. I'll tell a quick story. I was actually substitute teaching band at Washington High School recently, and I was just sitting there, and the band students were all there over lunch, and I was just listening to them talk about politics. And it was so fascinating that these, 16, 17-year-olds had some really in-depth thoughts on issues of immigration, taxing, all this kind of stuff. It was so refreshing to see that they were interested, but we need to be doing everything that we can to make sure that they know how to direct their interest and that they can find ways to be passionate about it. One thing that I know that I've personally really enjoyed campaigning so far is having unique opportunities to connect with people who aren't normally engaged in political events. So for example, I had like trivia fundraisers with different themes. So I'm a huge Harry Potter fan. My first trivia fundraiser was a Harry Potter trivia fundraiser, and I had so many people there who had never really been to political events or anything like that before. And I just took a little bit of time in the middle to talk about, why I wanted to run, why I was interested in politics. And people really, really liked that. It got new people into the political process. And I think anytime we can do that to help the younger people find something they're interested in, I think we should be looking at that.
All right, Stephen.
Thank you.
Microphone.
Thank you. Today I spoke at New Tech High School to the government class, and that's one way to do that, explain how the process works and get kids involved and help them to, I think, in large part try to dispel some of the myths that seem to be floating through the system these days. Personally, we have 8 kids and 14 grandkids, and I think they're understanding that politics is kind of an important thing to me, and their involvement in that process is an important aspect. I just happen to have some quotes of founding fathers. George Washington, General of the Revolutionary Army, President of the Constitutional Convention, first President of the United States, father of our nation. His statement was, "Religion and morality are the essential pillars of civil society." Ben Franklin, signer of the Declaration of Independence, and instrumental in developing the framework of our government. His quote was, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters." And we need to make sure our people are virtuous, and as I mentioned at the outset, the constitutional provision in regard to education says that we want to to provide public education to ensure that the stability of the republic is there through moral and intelligent people. And unfortunately, our shift in morals is degrading some of that. And so I think one of the most important things is you ensure that you have moral students, citizens, and I think as you have that, you have more of a consensus about where things should go and how they should function. But I would really hope that our young people understand the historical context of our government and the reason it's survived this long. There has never been a republic that's done well when it shifts to the idea of socialism, and that's unfortunately where we're going.
Doug?
Well, I'm going to put some of this back on us as parents. I think it's important that that's just part of upbringing of your children to expose them to a lot of different aspects of life and being involved in their government and the way that their city or their state or county are run, and being active in that, I think, is key to that. Just as a small piece, but we as legislators, we have a very strong internship program and legislative pages that granted it's a limited number of people, but we're able to rotate quite a few through as we go through our session. So it's a great way to expose them to that. And as a matter of fact, I think there are probably some that serve on the legislature and in elected offices that had that first exposure in those roles. So certainly a big supporter of that and would continue to advocate that.
All right, thank you very much. And we are over to Rachel. Next question is, right now, one of the largest economic development booms is in wind energy. What are your thoughts on renewable energy?
So I think renewable energy is something that it's the future. And I think that investing in renewable energy, whether that be solar, wind, hydro, anything like that, I think we need to really look into more. We have states across the nation that are doing things, especially with solar energy, and I think it's going to, once we get past the initial hurdle with cost, it's something that's going to save a lot of money for a lot of people when we can get to this point in renewable energy. I do know that there are some problems that things like wind energy brings, and looking at how we deal with that would have to be based on whatever sort of legislation that I would be looking at. But overall, I think making a push towards renewable energy is massively important, not just for cost savings, but just for the future of our planet.
All right, Stephen, right now, one of the largest economic development booms is wind energy. What are your thoughts on renewable energy?
I think renewable energy is a great idea. I think that they've finally discovered that actually oil and coal are renewable because they continue to develop those fields in the sense that the pressure of that product develops as the years go by. But set aside that idea, if we were really serious about having safe energy, we'd probably take another look at nuclear energy. I know that in Sweden they've gone to the new nuclear technology, and that is pretty efficient and pretty effective. It's just here we have this stigma against nuclear energy. For example, right over here, and I don't know how many of you know it, we had a nuclear meltdown right over here at the Eros exit. Years ago, that was the Pathfinder nuclear power plant. And it wasn't too many years ago that they took that core out of there finally, and then they overlaid it with, I think, 3 feet of lead. So that's what protects the surface over there. But new nuclear technology is pretty safe. It's something that really should be looked at. The idea of windmills, it's fine, but I don't think nuclear, or I don't think wind power, solar power, or let's say the third, the other energy, the renewable energies. Mm-hmm. They just ethanol. They just don't survive without federal subsidies. And that's not where we need to be either. If it's going to make it, it should make it on its own, and in an infrastructure as far as, like I say, some of these resources like nuclear energy, new nuclear energy, would probably be something we should actually look at. I'm glad we've got the hydroelectric plants in South Dakota. That's been great for the state and for the region. So I know there's a nuclear power plant on the north side of Minneapolis, at least one, maybe two, and the energy companies share the use of that, but it's degrading because of its age, so it's going to have to be replaced.
All right, Doug, what are your thoughts on renewable energy?
Well, I would welcome the day where we don't have a foreign tanker ship pulling into one of our ports delivering oil from overseas. If we can get to the point where we're self-sustaining with the resources that we have within our country and our state, I would certainly support that. Wind is one of those. And if there are ways that we can remove some of those government regulations to make it more affordable and cost-effective for some of these companies to invest in and provide that energy, then I certainly would be open to looking at that.
All right. Margaret, what are your thoughts on renewable energy?
Coming from a science and technology background, I'm definitely for renewable energy, and I think we can foresee lots of changes in that area, definitely in the nuclear and underwater and ethanol and the oil and the coal. There's a lot of options, and in this and today there's a lot of concerns about which direction to go. But I think as what we're going to see in the future is a very positive direction. I don't necessarily think that there's a quick answer to any of this with the federal regulations that's in place, and all that needs to be considered. And what's the future for South Dakota in renewable energy? Let's look at that. And coming from Texas, it's vast. And Texas would not be the state it is without the energy that it has. But definitely that's something we need to look at here in South Dakota.
All right, thank you. And we're back over starting with Stephen. Next question has a little bit of a preface to it. Okay, so with the Kavanaugh hearings and the testimony of Christine Blasey Ford and the talk of Me Too on a national level, we also know there have been numerous incidents from women in Pierre, including from lobbyists and former legislators that have encountered sexual harassment while working in the Capitol. What will you do to stop sexual harassment from happening in Pierre?
Well, if any of you paid attention to the one event that hit the news during the session last year, I was standing right there. And unfortunately, the truth didn't come out on some of that. And I was trying to deal with it discreetly with the two people that were involved. But I understand that it happens. There was one allegation that was made apparently by a lobbyist, and ultimately, after months, the story came out. It was because that person had been at this one particular event with another lobbyist. And there are things that go on in life all around us. Unfortunately, some people don't know how to conduct themselves appropriately. And what I'll personally do, if I'm speaker especially, is that I'll clamp down on some of the discourse in the Capitol itself. I know people sometimes find themselves in positions of authority or away from the people that might be paying more attention to what they're doing, and they start to behave like a bunch of fourth graders, and that's unfortunate. My intention is to maintain decorum in the chamber and in the lobbying areas. I can't control what happens after hours, and some people just need to understand that they should not put themselves in vulnerable positions. There's absolutely no excuse for anything to be going on with interns or pages, and that, as much as I can control anything, that would not happen under my watch. And some of those things needed to be addressed earlier than they were, and that's shame on the people that had a position of authority to do something about it before. So it's a reality, but people also need to just recognize that just because you're away from home doesn't mean you change your morals or your standards.
Doug, what will you do to stop sexual harassment from happening in Pierre?
Well, as I said, I've only been in the legislature for a year. I personally have not experienced or been in the know of anything of that sort. But that aside, I've got zero tolerance for harassment of any sort, especially sexual harassment. We're there to do a job. frankly, we're only there for 9 or 10 weeks, and to get to that point where you're being distracted by some of these sort of things, and even getting yourself into a position where you would be the the aggressor on something like that. I don't. I can't understand why people would do that, and as I said, I wouldn't have any tolerance for it. So I'd be, one of the first ones to lead the charge, whatever we have to do if we do encounter someone that's acting inappropriately, and deal with them, and frankly get rid of the problem.
All right, Margaret, what will you do to stop sexual harassment from happening in here?
I would definitely not tolerate this type of behavior, but, it's difficult to control another person. And that's why it is so important that we support good, moral people into the legislature. And let's all keep professional. Working in an engineering environment, I was 5 out of 150 men. Did I come across this? Absolutely. More than once. I won't tell you how I dealt with it. Well, I will tell you how I dealt with it. We had the same manager. I went to the manager and said, you need to deal with this immediately. Because if you don't, I will. So it does not mean that you react immediately as a woman. You need to react as a professional and deal with the situation. Is it difficult? Is it emotional? Absolutely. Have I known women that have been abused and raped? Absolutely, I have. And I do not support that. So coming from an environment where there were very few women in the workforce where I worked at, it was essential to be professional. And that's what I would encourage. And it's not just from the women's side. It comes the other direction as well. So it's both sides. So I definitely would not support that behavior.
All right, Rachel, what will you do to stop sexual harassment from happening in Pierre?
Well, I think this is a difficult issue. And I don't think anyone goes to Pierre thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to go sexually harass someone. But that kind of thing happens when a type of culture is created where certain things are okay. It starts with little things, little jokes that are just allowed to be said. No one kind of stops them. And those kind of things just kind of increase to making comments that you maybe should not make about someone that you work in a professional relationship with. And for those of you that know me, I'm not the type of person to sit by when those sorts of comments are made. I will always point it out. And that goes for other things besides just sexual comments. Any sort of discriminatory comments, you can count on me that I would point them out. And I think that that's something that we all need to, kind of adopt. That it might be someone that we consider a very close friend. It might be someone that we consider not a close friend. But we need to make sure that we're calling those issues out when we see them. I think also making sure that we have proper avenues for reporting these sorts of issues is huge. People who are subject to sexual harassment need to know that they can tell someone, they can take action, and just because someone might be in an important position of power, it does not make them above anyone else. It won't get brushed under the rug because the person who committed this act is high up or in the legislature. We need to make sure that people who are subject to this have a way to take action and feel that they're listened to.
All right, thank you. Looks like we're down to about our last 5 minutes, so I'm not going to be able to get to the remainder of the questions I've got in my pile here. We're going to go right now to the closing statements, and if you could add this in to your closing statement. I do have one last question from the audience. We can kind of scoot one more in here. Starting with Doug. Closing statement, and what has been your favorite part about running for office?
Well, again, thanks for the opportunity. Again, thanks for the opportunity to put this on. Unfortunately, I wish we could fill the place. Hopefully, we'll get a better audience, both reading it in print and watching the rebroadcast. But it kind of goes back to your original question of trying to get more people involved in politics and government, and it is. So thank you to those that did show up. I've truly enjoyed the privilege of serving in the legislature. It's not something that I take for granted. Matter of fact, it's hard to describe that feeling when you're actually down on the floor and you're doing the work that's impacting a lot of people. And when I first went into it, I thought it's pretty easy. You just vote yes or you vote no, and you just kind of move on to the next thing. Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of very important topics that we vote on, and there is no maybe button. We can't just decide I'm going to vote in the middle or I'm not going to vote on this one. You have to make a decision. So that you have to do what you think is best and what you think the people that you represent would want you to do. And so I come from a background of good, strong leadership. I've got good common sense, and I use that when I go into this. I'm not out there to see what kind of scorecard I can get. Frankly, if you don't like the way that I vote and the way that I carry myself when I'm out there, then don't reelect me, because I don't vote to try and get reelected. I vote to try and do what I think is best for the people of this district and of this state. But I certainly would welcome the opportunity to do it again, and I'll hope that people will support me. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Margaret.
I'd like to address the question first, is what I have enjoyed most, and that is knocking on doors. I have really, truly enjoyed meeting so many people out there, all ages, and having discussions with them, and just getting them to know them. And, South Dakota people are wonderful. And that's one thing I really loved about South Dakota, is the family values. And hardworking, and that is what I have come across when I knock on doors, is the concern for family, keeping a strong business climate, keeping a Second Amendment. I also come from a strong military background. My father was in the military, and I had two brothers that served in Vietnam. My husband served in the military. Both of his parents served in the military, and our daughter served in the military. So I'm definitely an advocate for the veterans. Also, common sense, that is so important, and experience. Not just experience in the business environment, having a degree in science and in business, but also just the experience of life. That is so important to be able to make good analytical decisions. I also believe in our South Dakota Constitution, and I believe in one nation under God.
All right, thank you. Rachel.
Well, first thing, one of the things I've enjoyed most is the dogs. I think everyone in Brandon has a dog. I'm fairly convinced every single person in Brandon has a dog, and I've loved it. But for real, I've really enjoyed. Like I mentioned before, with the themed trivia fundraisers, I've really enjoyed just getting new people involved in politics, registering new voters, no matter what age. It's been so much fun and so refreshing. And then I'm really excited that no matter what the outcome of this election is, that you're going to have a woman senator representing District 10, and I absolutely love that. And I hope you guys are really excited about that as well. And one thing that I was really worried about when I made the decision to run was that I'm young. I know I look 12. I'm 26. But I know I look younger than I am, and I would be one of the younger legislators in Pierre if I were elected. But we do have a citizens legislature in South Dakota, and I think that's amazing. But it means that we have to have people representing from all areas, and that includes some of the younger people. And I mentioned that I'm working on my master's in political science right now, and I've been able to really learn about what makes good public policy, what makes bad public policy, how you really look at the actions that you're trying to take and the actions that you're trying to change within how you write the policy, and how you need to account for the unintended consequences, and how you look for what they might be. And so we have a lot of amazing experts in Pierre right now in farming, business, all kinds of banking, all kinds of other areas. And so I might not know everything there is to know about farming, but I do know how to look at policy and read into it and look from every different angle and say, is this good policy? Will this help South Dakota? And I think we also need more people who are willing to make legislation that would change things 15, 20 years in the future for the better, rather than just ones that make us look good now. Thanks.
All right, Stephen.
Thank you very much. And as far as the dogs, I'm guessing there's somewhere around 2 to 3 dogs per house in District 10.
Oh, yeah.
This is our third time of going door to door, and there's a lot of dogs. And you just think about Sioux Falls, there's got to be 50,000 dogs in Sioux Falls. What I really care about, I don't care if you're male, female, young, old, what I care about for anybody that serves in the legislature is that they understand the Constitution and its underpinnings. And it's essential that people look at that. It's not to go out there and emotionally dish things out of the candy jar or cookie jar. It's to go out there and understand it's a very limited role, and it should be restricted to those things that fit within that Constitution, and not to go beyond the scope of that, but to honor the Constitution and the things that it calls upon us to do. The favorite part of running is probably, as others have said, going door to door, talking to people. And it's not very many people that you get to talk to because everybody's busy and you're kind of hitting everybody cold and they don't quite know what they might want to ask a half hour later. But I try to engage people as much as possible, discuss the ballot measures, talk through those, and explain what the pros and cons are. And I just enjoy the opportunity to have that discussion with a lot of people. So that's always been a good part of it. And I do enjoy representing the people of District 10, and I'm always looking forward to people that want to have a conversation about politics and about individual bills that come through. We have so many that come through each year, and I'm hoping we can fine-tune that process to give us a little bit more time to thoughtfully consider some of the more important bills. So that's one of the things I hope I can accomplish out there this year.
All right. Well, one thing I didn't mention at the beginning that I wanted to make sure everyone was aware that Challenger Barbara Saxton and Challenger Dean Kurtz we did reach out to them, but just never heard back from them. So that's why they're not in attendance here today. I want to thank the Brandon Valley Area Chamber of Commerce and the Brandon Valley Journal for sponsoring tonight's forum. Remember to tell your friends and neighbors who could not be here tonight to tune in to Alliance Communications local channel at 6 p.m. on Saturday, October 27th, and/or Sunday, October 28th, same time, 6 o'clock. We will also get this video posted on the Brandon Valley Chamber's YouTube channel, so you can find it there. And last but not least, please remember to vote on Tuesday, November 6th. Good luck to each of the candidates, and thanks to all who attended tonight's forum. Good night.